So hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another bit of Total War Warhammer quick match gameplay. Um, in this first game I'm playing as the Empire against the Dwarves led by Tecmo on the map MP Blue Ridge River. And as you can see we are definitely running a bit of a shady composition. So right off the bat, quickly going over my comp, I decided to run, for my comp is all handgunners, and this is going to be a double feature, kind of discussing this composition against dwarves and why I think it's both really powerful as well as maybe what you should try to do to counter it. Because this wasn't really a strat I'd ever considered doing up until this point, but then I thought, well, dwarves can't really run down handgunners. They're very slow. The only infantry they can have that can run them down is rangers who can barely keep up with them, and slayers, which they'll almost never field more than 2 units of. And so this, while Empire handgunners cannot trade 1-for-1 with dwarf thunderers or quarrelers, you can afford to field a lot of them with no real risk from the enemy side, other than your enemy's skirmishers and maybe their slayers, maybe their lords. Their lords are kind of quick. So dwarves could be have a real bit of trouble with this. So I was thinking that the theory crafting it, and now I decided to give it a shot, and I wanted to try it out against. This was the first game where I tried this out. Obviously, I'm running Boris Todbringer. I'm going very skimping on the front line. Bringing Boris here. He is only here with the Midland Rune Fan, Crush the Weak, and Stand Your Ground, mostly just for his own uses, because none of the rest of my army is really going to be engaging in melee. I do have 2 completely stripped down Empire captains on each flank. They are there to kind of absorb enemy charges. If my opponent decides to send slayers after me, they're there to shut them down, and then a single Jade Wizard here in the middle, of course with Dwellers below, as well as Earthblood. Just the very standard setup, basically just a support, and if my opponent blobs, so I can punish him heavily with Dwellers below. My army is built around 11 units of handgunners, which you can see are spread out around here into kind of a staggered formation, so that if my opponent does manage to come to grips with my front line, I'll be able to support him with supporting fire from the remaining handguns. In the very front, forward deployed, I do have the Vanguard deployed. I do have the Sterling's Revenge here for just Direction of Renown Free Company Militia. We're going to throw things into full speed, of course. These guys have a lot of armor-piercing DPS. They have Stalk. They have Immunity to Psychology, which doesn't really matter against dwarves. And they're decent melee combatants, so they're kind of my only melee force. And over here we do have Sterling's Revenge, which of course causes magic damage, which is not good against dwarves. But more importantly, though, they do cause they have, I think, more ammo actually than normal handguns. No, never mind. It's actually the same. But more importantly, they just have Stalk, and which allows me to position them into, or worm them into place I really want them in. My opponent does fire off a few shots with the, or will fire off a few shots with the Grudge Thrower there, trying to hit Boris. My opponent's army is a somewhat conventional army build against Empire, I think. Because usually when dwarves are going against Empire, you're expecting a lot of great swords supported by a handful of cavalry, often a flying lord, and a handful of skirmishers or artillery pieces. And so you'll usually see something like the Goblobber cannons, maybe a handful of thunders or quarrelers, and the rest of it just being a bunch of dwarf warriors, long beards, sometimes great weapons. So my opponent's army is fairly conventional here. He is bringing a rune lord with all 3 runes, as well as the one that, or whichever rune it is that buffs nearby units armor piercing damage. And of course, actually that's a lot of runes. I didn't even realize how many runes he brought. Or is that that's the generic runesmith. The runesmith is coming in with missile resistance, which will definitely cause me a bit of a problem there, as well as a boost to leadership. So definitely a very strong core here that can buff the nearby units and make them much more tanky, with all the various runes of negation, extra armor, and of course a rune of wrath and ruin if you can come close enough. For my opponent's main army, though, in the center here, he does have the Grumbling Guard, who of course are immune to vigor loss. I am kind of waiting with my handguns for my skirmish units to get on the flanks. So this line is basically built to counter a greatsword and cavalry spam, which is usually what you see from Empire. And so a bunch of hammers, a bunch of Grumbling Guard. The hammers might be a little bit overpriced or overkill, but nonetheless they're a very strong unit. And then some dwarf warriors with great weapons out on the flanks here, kind of surrounding a core of slayers to flex against cavalry, 2 grudge throwers, and 2 thunderers, which will hopefully shut down any minimal skirmish units that Empire would usually bring. So throwing things into fast forward here because I don't want to bore you guys with nothing happening really. Boris does take a little bit of artillery fire, which does nothing to him because grudge throwers are honestly a terrible choice at trying to shoot down flying lords, and that's not really what they're intended for. And my opponent wisely chooses to open fire on my cannon gunners, which are now approaching him at a pretty fast rate. But my opponent, of course, is going to be able to shoot down the flying lords, and that's not really what they're intended for. My opponent wisely chooses to open fire on my cannon gunners, which are now approaching him at a pretty fast rate. Now, my hidden units are finally getting revealed. The unfortunate fact is that the Sterling's Revenge has very short range. They only have 90 meters range, so they will struggle to get into range. Over here, you can see or they will struggle to get close without getting spotted. And over here, you can see Boris getting absolutely shot up by the Thunder, so I do back him off, not wanting to lose too much HP on him. Over here, though, Sterling's Revenge firing off on the Dwarf Warriors. On the other flank, we do have the Silver Bullets firing into the Dwarf Warriors. And these guys are fairly squishy, and I want to shut them down as quickly as I can. One of the nice things about fighting elite armies is with a lot of firepower is that usually elite infantry, with a very small handful of exceptions like Chosen, Black Orcs, and maybe I'm forgetting like one or two, don't have much more HP than generic infantry, than their generic infantry cousins. So these guys aren't much tankier than Dwarf Warriors, and they cost over twice as much. So I'm definitely getting a lot more bang for my buck when I shoot them up. Over here, you can see these handguns are getting badly mauled. These Sterling's Revenge lost a little bit of HP, and they do lose a model before managing to get clear. In the meantime, though, these Dwarf Warriors are practically annihilated. These Thunders are pretty badly beat up, in fact, from flanking fire that's coming in from this ever-increasing horde of handguns. And now a Dweller's Blow does come up, grabbing these Thunderers, and while they're trying to shoot at Boris, who's over here tying down these Dwarf Warriors to save the Sterling's Revenge, they're getting torn apart. Sterling's Revenge is actually even faster than normal handgunners, so they can actually outpace... anything the Dwarves bring except Slayers. In the meantime, my opponent's forces are getting absolutely shredded. The Grumbling Guards practically annihilated. The Hammers are practically annihilated. These Hammers over here are practically annihilated. And at this point, my opponent does decide to kind of end the game. And what was a pretty brutal and one-sided engagement, to be quite frank. And I did feel a little bad for my opponent there. This is definitely a bit of a cheese strat, but it's also a strat that completely capitalizes on how limited Dwarven comps are and what units the Dwarves... You basically, as Empire, you can always predict roughly the composition the Dwarves will bring against you. Yes, there's a little toss-up with the Dwarves, Runesmith or no Runesmith. Usually you'll see a Runesmith. It's almost always a pick. You can almost always expect Dwarf Warriors with great weapons, at least a handful of them, just to try to take on your great swords. Some Thunders, some Grudge Throws, a little bit of this artillery presence to shoo away your skirmishers, which Empire, and to shut down your armor while the front line tanks things out. My opponent definitely went a little heavier here on the front line to just slug it out with me rather than engage in a shooting match, whereas I decided to do the dishonorable thing and shoot him up. But I think this is definitely a strategy that can work, and works because of the restrictions really of dwarves. And I want to show you guys one more game with this similar strategy, just to kind of discuss a little bit of what you can do to counter this, or what can be done a little differently. And as you can see, none of my before hopping over to that one, none of my handgunners here did like an exemplary job as far as kill count goes. A lot of it came from the dwellers below, but and of course, usually units don't start bleeding models en masse until the very last bit. They lost about half of their models before they and were down to the last tethers of their HP. So there wasn't that much space for kills, but the amount of damage they did was absolutely ludicrous. So we were going to hop on over to a second game of this. So here we are, guys, with a very similar composition. Once again, going against the dwarves, led by Smokaz Koch. Smoka's Company of Heroes, I don't know, on the map Southern Waste. And we are running a very similar build. This time around, I had a few extra skills on good old Boris. So I left Foe Seeker and Deadly Onslaught on him. So I didn't have enough money for the handgunners. So I threw in Flagellants instead as kind of an extra cannon fodder frontline unit. The match starts almost immediately, and actually my Vanguard deploys Sterling because my opponent decided to bring a bit of an interesting build, Mass Miners, and a classic Dwarven Vanguard build. Mass Miners and Mass Rangers with great weapons. No Vanilla Rangers, though, fortunately for me. Backed up by a Rune Lord with a lot of his runes, including Rune of Hearth and Hall, I do believe it is. A Runesmith with... This is a very stripped down Runesmith, actually. I'm entirely sure. I'm trying to zoom in on this. What my opponent brought here with the Runesmith. Master Rune of Stromny Redbeard just to boost melee units. Interesting enough, no Rune of Wrath and Ruin or anything like that. My opponent basically brought him just to do damage. And then another interesting one, Master Engineer with Banner of Lost Holes to improve nearby units' weapon damage. So a bit of an interesting comp there. My opponent's backline, of course, composed of 5 ranged with 3 great weapons, one which is Ulthar's Raiders, who can be absolutely terrifying. They can really shred Flying Lords and, well, any Lord really, very, very quickly, or Hero, anything like that, with their Mark of Ulthar, which debuffs enemies and makes them vulnerable to ranged fire. And then Ikran Miners with Blasting Charges, as another regiment around. The rest of this is all Miners with Blasting Charges, who, if they can get close enough to my handgunners, can absolutely kind of actually devastate them with the Satchel Charges. And, yeah, no Nordic Gremlins Ironbreakers, which is a little fortunate for me, or maybe unfortunate, because it means that my opponent has more coverage. He has more units on the field. Regardless, you can see I did a different setup this time around, and of course we're immediately opening fire. But rather than doing the staggered formation, I had, well, it's a little staggered, but it's kind of a few rows forward, few rows back, and it's very wide. I was hoping to get a flank. I was expecting my opponent would be somewhere in the back, and if they had a box, then I could kind of hit him from all directions. And that's obviously not the case. So anyway, my handguns are teeing off. I immediately turn around Sterling's Revenge. I know they're not going to be able to escape here. So they're just trying to shoot up the Rangers with great weapons and doing a pretty good job of it. These guys have a lot of DPS. They're already knocking off several models. Over here, I'm pushing my captains forward, trying to get them on an interception path with the miners. Flagellants are moving because my right flank is a little weak as far as stopping power goes. And you can see these miners are already wavering. They're already suffering pretty badly. And I'm trying to get... Unfortunately, my focus fire was a little off early on. Here you can see my left flank, which was a little further out, is now pivoting inward, and the Ekron miners are going down like 9 pins. The captain is pushing in, though he will take a huge amount of fire from the Ulthar's Raiders. And over here you can see, actually these guys I do believe get they get routed. And over here you can see Boris diving in. The Jade Wizard isn't really moving right now. I don't really have much to do with him. He's kind of just here covering the center so that if my opponent tries to push in, the Jade Wizard can just tie his units down. Flagellants actually helped rout off these Flagellants. And or sorry, these miners. And over here, Dwellers Below is going down on my opponent's backline, trying to melt through a handful of these managed blasting charges, as well as these few Rangers with great weapons. Over here, you can see Sterling's Revenge is engaged on the Rangers with great weapons, and actually doing an absolutely awesome job at it. These guys are not bad melee combatants, and should definitely not... They're very comparable to, say, Empire Swordsmen. They definitely shouldn't be underestimated. Actually, these guys are probably better than Empire Swordsmen in a straight-up fight, because they are 9 veterancy. Free company. Flagellants got absolutely annihilated by the satchel charges, but as you can see, my opponent is being blocked by the Empire captains and all these units interfering. My handguns are decimating his Ulthar's Raiders over here, though the captain does break and flee. Boris over here in the meantime beating up on these miners, just trying to buy me some time for the handguns to do work. Over here I did throw a unit of handguns into the fray against miners. They will not do well. At the same time, miners have such bad melee stats that they will actually get tied down for quite a while by handguns, which is rather pitiful. And you can see the handguns are even doing some damage to them. Because their melee stats are not good at it by any means, but they have some weapon strength, and they're not. Neither. It's like two guys hitting each other with pool noodles. And over here, of course, Boris took a huge beating, so he's taken off. He's getting clear of the fight, and the handguns are just wailing on my opponent. He did bring his Rune Lord on a Anvil of Doom, and is trying to get into my backline, disrupt these handguns, but it's really not going to be a saving grace here. You can see all this handgun fire just crisscrossing around. The Rune Lord being mounted on an anvil makes him vulnerable to the crossfire from the handguns, which would normally be... You could normally shake it off with a Dwarf Lord, because you just get into the fight and stay low. Because you're so short. This Runesmith's tying down these handguns being tied down by an engineer and miners, and the Flagellants, of course, have been overwhelmed. So my right flank's basically failed. The captain's still doing a little bit of work. These handguns are still teeing off. Over here, Sterling's Revenge is taking on 2 Rangers with great weapons. And it's important to keep in mind, Sterling's Revenge, while fairly expensive, they're 850, I think, are doing a very good job here. The Rangers with great weapons are both, I do believe, for about 650 cost, and they're holding off both of them in melee. It's definitely a good job there. Boris dives in to help the Flagellants, who are not going to be long for this world. Over here, my Jade Wizard is getting really badly messed up. Crossfire coming in from all these handguns is just annihilating units left and right. They're not even able to come to grips. Finally, these handgunners over here do get routed off by the Rune Lord. You can see some Ulthar's Raiders and Ekron miners coming back, so I'm pushing the Empire Captain into him to just slow him down and hopefully stop him. Though you can see the massive amount of throwing axes coming into him. He's not going to be long for this world. The Ulthar's Raiders are going to put him down really, really easily. Or maybe the miners do. One of those two will. The Rune Lord, though, getting annihilated. Jade Wizard still tying these guys down. Over here, my opponent is winning the right flank somewhat decisively. I was not as much on top of my micro as I really should have been. Over here, Boris is being an opportunist and picking off poor buggers over there. These miners might actually lose to these handguns in the long run. And you can see I do drop a Dwellers Below over here, because the Earthblood is not particularly useful here. Most of the units are killing my handguns so quickly that the Earthblood isn't really going to keep them alive. And over here you can see, though, the Rune Lord is getting picked apart. I might have been better off actually just bringing the other healing spell. I forget what it's called for Lore of Life. The one that it's just a targeted single target heal, and it does more, and it gives you physical resistance. Regardless, you can see the Ulthar's Raiders and some of the Rangers with great weapons are getting on the flank here, throwing axes at the handgunners. But this game is not long. Not long until it's over. Master Engineer getting smushed by Dwarves over here. Captain coming back. Handguns are back online. Some handguns. Sterling's Revenge actually fought these guys off and is still around and kicking over there. And so, Bit of a brutal game. You can see Sterling's Revenge racked up 101 kills, fighting essentially rangers with right weapons the whole time. In melee, these guys are very good. Don't underestimate Free Company. You see them in my Vanguard deployment video. These guys are not terrible. I'm not a big fan of them usually but especially Sterling's Revenge is really strong because they have a combination of armor piercing and good melee stats. Handguns this time around got a lot of kills because the game dragged out for... my opponent didn't throw in the towel immediately. He definitely gave a great accounting and did his absolute best there. If he had some vanilla rangers with crossbows, he might have had a somewhat better chance. It's part of the reason why I usually bring fewer great weapons and more crossbows when I play as the dwarves, if I do a Vanguard build, to shut down enemy skirmishers. Regardless, those handguns did brutal work, and several were still very healthy. Only 3 units really were knocked down to a low level, and of my heroes, Jade was I only lost the captain and some flagellants. So of my front line, so this build is absolutely brutal. And I understand that it's a bit of a cheese, but I'm not even entirely sure. Like, it is a build, it's a gimmicky build that's built around the dwarf's limitations, and I think that if you have to anticipate this sort of possibility from Empire. Some of the good units to counter it is always bring a few Quarrelers or bring Goblobber, because the Goblobber can rout enemies off. Make sure to bring shields. Your Thunders can engage in a 1-to-1 fight with handgunners, and they can actually slow them down quite a bit. So if you bring some shields and your enemy is doing just massed handguns, this isn't a likely build, but it is possible, as I'm proving here essentially. And if they're doing this, then your best bet might be to... People usually don't go as all-in either, I think. Usually people will go... Let's have some melee to mop things up. But you can apply pressure to the handguns. They can only fire on a frontal arc. So if you can apply some pressure to them with your melee units and push up behind them with Thunders and Quarrelers and just apply firing pressure, as well as fire from, say, Goblobber or a Grudge Thrower, make sure to keep them away from your skirmish units so they can't just volley them down and then wreck your infantry. If you can do that, then I think you can definitely beat this sort of build. But you definitely have to be aware that it exists. Kind of plan accordingly. It's definitely a bit of a brutal and cheesy build. I'm not gonna peddle around that. It simply is what it is. But it works very effectively. It does not require any coordination of specific units. Like, for example, it does, but you don't necessarily need the coordination of specific magics. For example, with the Empire Cav Cheese build. It's not even necessarily I think it's a weird build, but it is a viable build here, and so I wanted you guys to be aware, and I wanted to show this off. Partially, I also just wanted to try out for myself to see if this works, because I was theory crafting. I'm like, oh, dwarves are slow as dirt, so I could probably volley them down if I just bring enough handguns. And it definitely seems to be the case. So hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it gave you guys some ideas on both how your dwarf play as well as your empire play. Thanks to both of my opponents for the great games. And yeah, I hope you guys find this useful. If you liked it, if you have any comments, criticism, if you want to scream at me for being a scumbag, feel free. If you have any questions about quick play, anything like that, feel free to post down in the comments below, and I'll respond as soon as I can. And yeah, as usual, guys, I appreciate you all for watching. And I'll see you in the next one. Wyvern out.